Ambassador Lyra Chun had lived aboard the Communion of Voices for 6 standard months. And in that time she had become invisible. Not literally invisible, of course, but invisible in the way that small and harmless things become invisible when surrounded by the large and the dangerous. The Communion of Voices was a diplomatic vessel of the Volanti Federation, crewed by some of the most respected species in the known galaxy. And Lyra was their first human guest. She had arrived with a single bag of personal belongings, a translation implant behind her ear, and a smile that never seemed to fade. The Volanti themselves were magnificent creatures, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with iridescent scales that shifted color with their moods. And they moved through their ship with the confidence of apex predators who had never known fear. Their captain, Commander Vesarani, had greeted Lyra on her first day with what she later learned was polite condescension. "Welcome aboard, little ambassador," he had said, his scales flickering to a pale blue that indicated mild amusement. "We will do our best to accommodate your species' many requirements." Lyra had simply smiled and thanked him for his kindness. The other species aboard were equally impressive in their own ways. The Cricks were insectoid beings with razor-sharp mandibles and compound eyes that could see in spectrums humans could not imagine. And they communicated through a complex series of clicks and chirps that the translation implant struggled to fully capture. The Morathi were perhaps the strangest of all, being gelatinous creatures without fixed form who could squeeze through spaces no solid being could manage. And they regarded Lyra with the distant curiosity one might show toward an unusual rock. There were others too, dozens of species from across the galaxy. Each one evolved on worlds that had shaped them into something formidable. And then there was Lyra. The ship's database contained a file on her species that she had once managed to glimpse on an unattended terminal Homo sapiens. It read, "Origin world designated Sol 3, also called Earth. Status: provisional membership in Galactic Community, pending evaluation period." The file continued with clinical detachment, physiological assessment, minimal natural weaponry, no venom glands or toxin production, no natural armor or protective carapace, no electromagnetic sensitivity or projection capabilities, substandard strength to mass ratio compared to galactic average, limited sensory range. Then came the part that had made Lyra smile. Evolutionary history note: species classified as persistence predator in origin, meaning ancestors hunted by pursuit rather than ambush. However, this trait is considered an evolutionary relic with no bearing on modern behavior. Humans are primarily intellectual and diplomatic in nature. Threat assessment: negligible, negligible. She had read that word several times before closing the file. From that day forward, Lyra had done nothing to challenge their assessments, asked questions constantly. Always curious, always eager to learn about their cultures and customs and histories. She remembered the names of crew members' children and the dates of important ceremonies. She offered to help with tasks that others found tedious, spending hours in the botanical bay with Dr. Tith organizing samples, or in the kitchen learning recipes from the ship's cook. She was friendly and warm and unfailingly polite when the Volanti made jokes at her expense, commenting on her small size or her lack of claws. She laughed along with them when the Cricks clicked their mandibles in what she knew was amusement at her struggles to open sealed containers designed for stronger hands. She simply asked for help with a self-deprecating shrug when the Morathi flowed around her in the corridors without acknowledgement. She stepped aside and continued on her way. She became a fixture in the recreation bay each evening, sitting in her favorite corner with a warm cup of something the cook had created specifically for human taste preferences. Watching the stars drift past the viewport, the crew grew comfortable with her presence. The way one grows comfortable with furniture. She was simply there, part of the background, harmless and forgettable. But if anyone had watched her closely, truly watched her, they might have noticed things. They might have noticed that her eyes never stopped moving, tracking every person who entered or exited the room, cataloging positions and distances and potential obstacles. They might have noticed that she always sat with her back to a wall and a clear line of sight to every exit. They might have noticed that when something unexpected happened, a loud noise or a sudden movement, she never startled, never flinched, never showed the instinctive prey response that the other peaceful species displayed. Instead, there would be a fraction of a second where her body went completely still, followed by a relaxation so deliberate it could only be performance. They might have noticed the calluses on her hands, hidden beneath diplomatic gloves, or the way she moved through crowded spaces without ever brushing against another being. Her spatial awareness almost supernatural in its precision. They might have noticed that when she smiled, the expression reached her mouth, but not always her eyes. As if warmth was a language she had learned rather than a native tongue. But no one watched her closely. Why would they? She was human, and humans were harmless. And the galaxy had made up its mind about that long before Lyra Chun had ever set foot on an alien vessel 6 months into her posting. Lyra had learned more about the galactic community than any human before her. She had learned their languages and their customs and their histories. She had learned which species were allies and which were rivals and which were threats. She had learned that the Shrike Collective, a race of parasitic raiders from the Outer Rim, had been growing bolder in recent months, attacking settlements and relay stations with increasing frequency. She had learned that the Volanthi considered themselves protectors of the weaker species, a role they took seriously but also used to reinforce their own sense of superiority. And she had learned, most importantly, that the galaxy had forgotten what it meant to be truly dangerous. The predators here announced themselves with fangs and claws and armor, with size and strength and obvious menace they had never encountered. A species that smiled while it calculated angles of attack. They had never met a people who had spent millions of years being hunted by creatures far more deadly than themselves, and had survived not by becoming stronger, but by becoming smarter. They had never looked into the eyes of a persistence predator and understood what it meant to be prey that refused to die. Lyra Chun sat in her corner of the recreation bay and watched the stars. Somewhere out there, she knew danger was coming. She did not know when or in what form, but she could feel it the way her ancestors had once felt the approach of predators in tall grass. A pricking at the back of her neck, a tightening in her chest when it came. She would be ready. She took a sip of her drink and smiled at a passing Volanthi, who nodded absently in response. Just another evening aboard the Communion of Voices. Just another harmless human watching the stars. Relay Station Kef 7 was supposed to be a routine stop. Communion of Voices had docked at the spinning cylinder of metal and light for resupply, giving the crew a chance to stretch their legs and browse the market district that occupied the station's central hub. Lyra had been looking forward to this stop for weeks. The station was known throughout the sector as a meeting place for travelers from 100 different worlds, and its markets were famous for carrying goods that could not be found anywhere else. She wandered through the crowded stalls with wide eyes, taking in the colors and sounds and smells of a dozen alien cultures mixing together. A Volanthi merchant called out to her, offering fabrics that change color in response to the wearer's emotions. A Crix trader displayed intricate mechanical devices whose purpose Lyra could not begin to guess. A Morathi had spread itself across an entire booth, its gelatinous body serving as both salesperson and display case for the jewelry embedded within its translucent mask. Lyra purchased a small carved figure from a species she did not recognize, a little wooden creature with too many eyes and a friendly expression. She thought it might look nice on the shelf in her quarters, she was examining a booth selling preserved foods when the first explosion rocked the station. The sound was enormous. A thundering boom that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And the lights flickered and died before emergency systems kicked in. Bathing everything in harsh red for one heartbeat, the entire market district went silent. Then, the screaming began. Lyra did not scream. She did not run. Instead, she went very still. Her eyes scanning the chaos around her. Processing information faster than conscious thought. Explosion came from the docking ring. She noted multiple impacts based on the sound pattern. Coordinated attack rather than accident around. Or the peaceful species of the galaxy did what peaceful species do when faced with sudden violence. They panicked. Volante merchants abandoned their stalls and ran for the exits. Their scales flashing bright patterns of Terra Crix. Traders burrowed into any available hiding space. Their mandibles clicking in distress. A Morathi tried to squeeze through a ventilation grate that was too small. Its body tearing apart in its desperation to escape. Lyra watched a young Volante child become separated from his family in the crush of bodies. Standing frozen in the middle of the corridor as the crowd surged around him, she moved toward him without thinking, placing her hand on his shoulder and guiding him to the relative safety of an alcove. "Stay here," she told him in the calmest voice she could manage. "Stay hidden and do not move until someone comes for you." The child stared at her with huge frightened eyes, but nodded. Lyra turned back to face the market. That was when she saw them. They came out of the smoke like nightmares given form. Tall and angular beings with exoskeletons so dark they seemed to absorb the emergency lighting. Their limbs ended in blades that gleamed with molecular sharpness. And they moved with the terrible fluid grace of creatures designed by evolution for one purpose, only killing Shrikes. Lyra had studied them in the ship's database, reading accounts of their attacks on settlements throughout the Outer Rim. The Shrike Collective was not a civilization in any meaningful sense, not a culture with art or philosophy or dreams of peace. They were raiders and parasites, a species that had evolved to take from others because taking was easier than building. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners except for food. They did not show mercy because mercy was a concept that had never developed in their evolutionary history. 7 of them had cornered a group of fleeing civilians at the end of a corridor that had been sealed by emergency bulkheads. 23 beings of various species huddled together in terror, including 3 Volante security officers who had drawn their plasma weapons with shaking claws. The Shrikes advanced slowly, savoring the moment. They were in no hurry. Their prey had nowhere to go. One of the security officers fired a desperate shot that went wide, burning a hole in the wall several meters from the nearest Shrike. The creatures clicked in what might have been laughter. "Stand down," the lead Shrike said, its voice a harsh rasp that the translation implant rendered in flat mechanical tones. "You will only make this more painful for yourselves." The civilians wailed. Some prayed to gods Lyra had never heard of. A Crix was trying to dig through the sealed bulkhead with its mandibles, desperate for any escape. And then Lyra pushed through the crowd. She moved past the terrified civilians, past the trembling security officers, until she stood between the huddled prey and the advancing predators. "Human," one of the Volante officers hissed, reaching for her with a clawed hand. "Get back. You cannot help here. You will only die." Lyra did not get back. She walked forward. The Shrikes paused, not out of fear, because Shrikes did not feel fear, but out of confusion, because prey was not supposed to approach predators. "You are making a mistake," Lyra said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. The friendly diplomat vanished like morning fog. And what remained was something flat and cold and utterly calm. One small human, the lead Shrike rasped, its mandibles spreading in what might have been amusement. "Come to die before the others." Lyra kept walking. "I am giving you one chance," she said. Turn around and leave. Take your ships and go. Do not come back." The Shrikes looked at each other. Then they made that clicking sound again. "The one that meant laughter. It thinks it can threaten us," the leader said. How delightful! The creature lunged. It was fast. Far faster than anything that size had any right to be. Its blade arms slicing through the air toward Lyra's throat. She should have died. Any reasonable assessment of the situation would have concluded that the small soft human would be cut in half before she could even register the attack, but Lyra Chun was not any human, and the Shrikes had made the same mistake that everyone else in the galaxy had made. They had looked at her size and her softness and her warm smile, and they had seen prey. They had not seen the millions of years of evolution that had shaped her species. They had not seen the ancestors who had faced creatures far more terrifying than Shrikes and had survived. They had not seen the predator that lived beneath her skin. Lyra did not retreat from the attack. She stepped into it. Commander Vethsarani had watched the recording 17 times. Each viewing left him more disturbed than the last. Not because of the violence itself, for he was a soldier who had seen violence before, but because of what the violence revealed. The recording had been pulled from a damaged security sensor in the market district of Relay Station Keth 7. The quality was poor, degraded by smoke and emergency lighting and the chaos of the attack. But it was clear enough. 47 seconds of footage that had already been copied and analyzed by Galactic Security, shared among the intelligence services of a dozen species, and classified at the highest levels. 37 seconds that had changed everything the galaxy thought it knew about humans. With Sarani sat alone in his ready room aboard the communion of voices, the recording playing on a loop on his personal displaying the footage. Ambassador Lyra Chun stood facing 7 Shrike raiders. The first Shrike lunged at her with its blade arm, a killing strike that should have ended her life in an instant. Instead, she stepped forward into the attack rather than away from it, moving past the arc of the blade with a precision that seemed impossible. Her hands found the joints where the creature's exoskeleton met softer tissue, and she used its own momentum against it, twisting its arm backward with a sharp motion that produced a crack audible even on the damaged recording. The Shrike fell, its own blade embedded in its chest. The second attacker came before the first had finished collapsing. Lyra dropped low, rolling beneath its sweeping strike, and came up behind it in a single fluid motion. Her fingers drove into a spot at the base of its skull that Vethsarani would later learn was a nerve cluster common to many exoskeletal species. The creature dropped like a puppet whose strings had been cut. 3 seconds had passed too. Shrikes were down. The third one died with a piece of broken market stall driven through its eye socket. Lyra had grabbed the metal shard from the ground without even looking at it, her hand finding the makeshift weapon as naturally as if it had been placed there for her. The fourth, fifth, and sixth Shrikes attacked together. Having finally realized that this small human was not prey, the recording became chaotic at this point. Bodies moving too fast for the damaged sensor to track clearly. Flashes of movement and sprays of dark ichor. But Vethsarani had watched it enough times to piece together what happened. The fourth Shrike lost its blade arm at the elbow joint, then died when Lyra used the severed limb to stab it through the throat. The fifth had its legs swept out from under it, then took a heel to its skull with enough force to crack the exoskeleton. The sixth managed to land a glancing blow that opened a cut along Lyra's forearm, the only wound she would receive in the entire encounter. She responded by grabbing its blade arm with her bare hands and using the creature's own momentum to flip it onto its back, then stomping down on its throat with her boot. When the recording cleared, 6 Shrikes lay in expanding pools of ichor, and Lyra Chun stood among them. She was breathing evenly. Her expression was blank. Her hands were covered in dark alien blood, and she was watching the 7th Shrike, this last creature had hung back during the attack. Perhaps a leader accustomed to letting others do the killing. Now it stood alone, facing the small human who had just slaughtered 6 of its companions in less than a minute. The Shrike was visibly trembling. Viscerani had not known that Shrikes could tremble. The creature took one step backward, then another, then turned and ran a Shrike raider, a member of a species that had terrorized the Outer Rim for generations. Fled from a single human. Lyra watched it go without pursuing. Then she turned back to the huddled civilians. And the transformation was instant and complete. The cold blankness vanished from her face, replaced by warm concern. "Is everyone all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Is anyone injured?" The recording in dead Vesserani stared at the frozen final frame for a long moment around him. The ready room was silent, except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. Thought about all the times he had made jokes about the human ambassador. All the times he had patted her on the head or commented on her small size or laughed at her inability to open sealed containers. He thought about the entry in the ship's database, the one that classified her species as negligible threats. He thought about the warmth in her eyes when she asked about his daughter, the patience with which she learned their customs, the kindness she showed to every member of his crew, all of it real, and all of it existing alongside what he had just witnessed. "Computer," he said, his voice hoarse. "Display human species classification file." The file appeared, showing all the assessments he had read before. The notes about minimal natural weaponry and substandard strength and evolutionary relics. Update threat assessment. Vev Sarani said the computer waited for his input. He thought about the 7 Shrikes, about the way Lyra had moved through them like wind through grass, about the look in her eyes when the warmth disappeared. Update threat assessment, he repeated. Classification, unknown. He paused. "No," he said quietly. "Classification, do not provoke." The computer registered the update. Sarani turned off the display and sat in the darkness of his ready room, thinking about the small harmless human he had welcomed aboard his ship 6 months ago. He wondered what else he had missed. He wondered what else the galaxy had missed, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that still remembered what it felt like to be prey on his species' ancient homeworld, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt afraid. The Galactic Security Council had not convened an emergency session in over 40 standard years. The last time had been during the Krix border war, when 2 species had threatened to drag half the galaxy into conflict. Now, representatives from 47 species filled the circular chamber on Station Prime, the political heart of the galactic community, and all of them were there because of a single 47-second recording. The chamber was designed to impress. A vast domed space with seats arranged in concentric rings around a central display. Platform light filtered through crystalline panels in the ceiling, casting rainbow patterns across the assembled delegates. At the center of it all stood the council speaker, a being of living crystal whose form pulsed with soft blue light when it spoke. "This emergency session of the Galactic Security Council is now in order," the speaker announced, his voice resonating through the chamber. "The matter before us is the reclassification of species designation Sol 3 Prime, commonly known as humanity." Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates on one side of the chamber. The human delegation sat in a section that had been hastily expanded to accommodate their sudden importance. At their head was a tall man with gray hair cut short, and eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything. In Return Director Samuel Okonkwo of Earth's Diplomatic Corps had arrived on Station Prime 12 hours ago, and in that time he had said almost nothing. Now the speaker's crystalline form turned toward him. "Director Okonkwo, you have seen the evidence presented to this council. The recording from Relay Station Kef 7. The reports from our intelligence services. The updated assessments from our military analysts. I have, Okonkwo replied, his voice calm. Then you understand why this council requires explanation. The speaker continued. Your species was classified as non-threatening during initial contact assessment. Your representative single-handedly killed 6 Shrike Raiders in close combat. These facts appear to be contradictory. Okonkwo stood and walked slowly to the center platform, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent chamber. They are not contradictory, he said. They are simply incomplete. Explain. Okonkwo touched a control on the central display, and images began to appear above the platform. Ancient cave paintings showing stick figures with spears, facing massive beast skeletal, remains of creatures with fangs longer than human, arms reconstructions of the predators that had stalked human ancestors across the grasslands of Earth. When we first made contact with the galactic community, you asked us to describe our species, Okonkwo said. We told you we were persistence predators, that our ancestors survived by chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, that we could run for hours in conditions that would kill most other species. All of this was true. He paused, letting the translator catch up for the dozens of species in the chamber. But you heard persistence predator, and you thought you understood us. You thought we were hunters, patient and methodical, but ultimately suited for chasing rather than fighting. You classified us accordingly and moved on. More images appeared. These ones showing human ancestors huddled around fires while eyes gleamed in the darkness beyond the light. What you did not understand is that we were also prey. The chamber stirred. For most of our evolutionary history, we were hunted by creatures far more dangerous than ourselves. Creatures with fangs and claws and strength that made us look like insects by comparison. We were soft and slow and weak, and we should have died. Okonkwo looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who had spent centuries believing they understood the universe. We did not die. He touched the control again, and new images appeared. We survived by learning to understand predators better than they understood themselves. We learned to read their movements, predict their attacks, exploit their weaknesses. We developed throwing arms that could strike from distance with lethal precision, a trait almost unique in the galaxy. We developed cooperative strategies that allowed us to bring down creatures many times our size. And we developed something else. He continued, his voice dropping lower. We developed the ability to control our fear. The speaker's crystalline form pulsed with agitation. Every prey species feels fear, Okonkwo said. It is the most basic survival instinct. The warning that danger is near, the command to flee. But humans learned something that changed everything. Paused. We learned that we could feel fear and choose not to obey it. The chamber was utterly silent. Ambassador Chun did not stop being afraid when those shrikes attacked. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run, to hide, to do what prey animals do when faced with predators. But she is human, and humans have spent millions of years teaching ourselves that fear is information, not command. He spread his hands. She walked toward those shrikes because she chose to. She killed them because she was trained to. She saved those civilians because that is what humans do. We protect those who cannot protect themselves, even when protection means becoming something terrifying. A delegate from the Volanti Federation rose. You hid this from us. The delegate accused, his scales flashing anger colors. You presented yourselves as harmless diplomats while concealing your true nature. We hid nothing, Okonkwo replied evenly. Every fact about our species is available in your own databases. Our evolutionary history as persistence predators. Our wars, our martial arts, our weapons development. All of it is there for anyone who cared to look. He shook his head, but you did not look. You saw small bodies and friendly smiles, and you assumed that meant we were harmless. That was your assumption, not our deception. You could have corrected our assumption, another delegate called out. We tried, Okonkwo said. During initial contact negotiations, our representatives attempted to explain the complexity of human nature. We were told that our primitive threat displays were unnecessary and somewhat embarrassing. Uncomfortable shifting among the delegates who had been present during those negotiations. You wanted us to be harmless. Okonkwo continued. You needed us to fit into your categories. Peaceful species or dangerous species. Prey or predator, but humans are neither and both. We are creatures who looked into the darkest parts of existence and decided that kindness was still worth choosing. He walked back toward the human delegation. Ambassador Chun could have killed that seventh Shrike. She was faster than it, better trained, and she had already proven she could defeat them in combat. But she let it run, not because she could not kill it, but because she did not need to. He turned back to face the chamber one final time. That is what humans are. We are not predators pretending to be prey. We are not wolves in sheep's clothing. We are something your classifications have no name for. We are creatures who choose to be kind. Not because we are weak, but because we are strong enough to make that choice. The chamber erupted in noise. Delegates shouting questions and accusations and demands for further explanation. But Okonkwo simply walked back to his seat and sat down. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to the galaxy to understand. 3 weeks after the incident at Relay Station Keth 7, Lyra Chun returned to the communion of voices. The journey from Station Prime had been quiet, the transport that carried. Her back was crewed by Volanthi, who spoke to her only when necessary and watched her with scales that flickered constant alert colors. She did not take it. Personally, everything had changed, and everyone needed time to adjust. She understood that better than anyone. The airlock of the communion of voices cycled open with a familiar hiss, and Lyra stepped aboard the ship that had been her home for the past 6 months. The corridor beyond was empty, not just unoccupied, but deliberately cleared, as if the crew had been warned of her arrival and had made themselves scarce. Only Commander Vethsarani stood waiting for her. His scales a carefully neutral gray. Ambassador Chen, he said formally. Welcome back, Commander, she replied with a small smile. Thank you for having me. They stood in silence for a moment. Two beings who had thought they knew each other discovering how wrong they had been. I must confess, Vethsarani said finally. The crew is still adjusting. To what? To seeing you clearly. Lyra nodded slowly. She had expected this. The recording from Keth 7 had spread across the galaxy in a matter of hours. Copied and shared and analyzed until there was not a sentient being in known space who had not seen the small human. Ambassador killing 6 Shrike Raiders with her bare hands. The diplomatic community was in an uproar. 3 species had already petitioned to have humanity's provisional membership revoked. 14 others had sent urgent requests for military exchange programs. Everyone wanted to know what humans really were, and no one seemed satisfied with the answers. I am the same person I was before Keth 7, Lyra said gently. I still enjoy helping Dr. Tith with her botanical samples. I still think your ship's cook makes the best protein gel in the sector. I still remember that your daughter's bonding ceremony is next month. Yes, Vethsarani said, his scales flickering with something that might have been unease. But now we know what else you are. You always knew, Lyra replied. Your database has contained accurate information about human capabilities since first contact. Our evolutionary history, our combat training, our capacity for violence, all of it was there. Information is not understanding. No, she agreed. It is not. She began walking down the corridor toward her quarters. And after a moment, Vethsarani fell into step beside her. The ship felt different now when they passed other crew members. Conversation stopped. Velanthi crew members who had once made friendly jokes at her expense now pressed themselves against the walls to let her pass. Their scales bright with involuntary alarm, a group of Crix traders who had booked passage on the vessel clicked frantically as she approached, then scattered into side corridors. Even the Marathi, who had always ignored her completely, now pulsed with nervous energy when she walked by. Lyra kept her expression pleasant and her pace steady. She did not let them see that it hurt. "They are afraid of you," Vetsarani observed quietly. "I know. Does that bother you?" Lyra considered the question as they walked. "Yes and no," she said finally. "I do not want to be feared. Fear creates distance, and distance makes understanding impossible. But I also cannot pretend to be something I am not." They reached her quarters, and the door slid open to reveal the small space, exactly as she had left it there. Few personal belongings were arranged on the shelves, including the little carved figure with too many eyes that she had purchased on Keth 7 just before everything changed. "When I was a child," Lyra said, turning to face the commander, "my grandmother told me a story about our ancestors. She said that millions of years ago, humans were the most frightened creatures on Earth. Every shadow could hide a predator. Every rustle in the grass could mean death. We lived in constant terror." Vetsarani listened, his scales settling into deeper patterns of attention. "But fear alone would have destroyed us," Lyra continued. "Creatures that are only afraid cannot think, cannot plan, cannot work together. So we learned to do something impossible. We learned to feel the fear, acknowledge it, and then set it aside." She touched the little carved figure on her shelf, running her fingers over its too many eyes. "We learned that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being afraid and choosing to act anyway." "And the violence?" Vetsarani asked. "The things you did to those shrikes, the violence is part of it," Lyra admitted. "We cannot pretend otherwise. Humans are capable of terrible things. Our history is full of wars and cruelty and destruction that would horrify any peaceful species." She turned back to face him. "But that is precisely why we choose to be kind." "I do not understand." "We know what we are capable of," Lyra said. "We know the darkness that lives inside us, the predator that can emerge when survival demands it. And because we know it, we can choose to be something else." She smiled, and this time the warmth reached her eyes. "A species that has never known violence cannot truly choose peace. They are simply following their nature. But humans choose peace every day, every hour, every moment. We choose it because we know the alternative." Vetsarani was silent for a long time. His scales shifted through colors that Lyra had learned to recognize as deep contemplation. "You saved 23 lives on that station," he said finally, "including one of our youngest crew members, a child who had become separated from his family. Yes, you killed to protect strangers, beings who had dismissed you and mocked you and treated you as less than them." "Yes." Why, Lyra thought about the question, thought about the terrified faces of the civilians she had saved, thought about the small Velanthi child who had clung to her afterward with absolute trust, because they needed help. She said simply, "And I could help them, even though they had treated you poorly. Kindness is not a transaction." Lyra replied, "I am not kind because others deserve it. I am kind because that is who I choose to be." She looked out the viewport at the stars drifting slowly past. "Humans have a saying. To be gentle is not to be weak. Gentleness is strength held in check, controlled and directed toward protection rather than destruction." She touched her reflection in the glass. "I am gentle because I am strong enough to afford gentleness. I am kind because I have seen what happens when kindness fails. And I will protect those who cannot protect themselves, not because they have earned it, but because that is what it means to be human." The Sarani studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, His scales shifted to a color she had never seen him display before. It was a deep, warm blue. The color of profound respect. I believe I am beginning to understand, he said. That is all any of us can ask. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Ambassador Chun. I must ask one more thing. Yes, the seventh strike, the one that fled. Why did you let it go? Lyra smiled. Because I did not need to kill it. It was no longer a threat. It was just afraid. And no one deserves to die simply because they are afraid. Vetsarani nodded slowly. I will leave you to rest, he said. Dinner will be served in the main hall in 3 hours. If you wish to join us, I would like that very much. He left. And Lyra stood alone in her quarters. Watching the stars, she thought about the journey ahead. About the difficult work of rebuilding trust. About the conversations that would need to happen and the misunderstandings that would need to be addressed. She thought about the galaxy that was slowly learning what humans really were. Not harmless or dangerous, but something far more complex, something that could kill without hesitation. When killing was necessary, something that could show mercy when mercy was possible, something that had looked into the void and chosen, against all reason, to answer darkness with light, somewhere out there. The seventh strike was telling others what it had witnessed somewhere out there. Species were updating their files and reconsidering their assumptions, and somewhere out there, the galaxy was beginning to understand that the small soft creatures from the unremarkable yellow star were more than they appeared. They were human, and that meant everything.